Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you to today's public lecture hosted by the St. Kitts and Nevis Medicinal Cannabis Authority. Chair of the Board of the Medicinal Cannabis Authority, Mrs. Jean Williams Knight, and members of the board, CEO of the Medicinal Cannabis Authority, Mr. Nadiv Mills, consultant to the Medicinal Cannabis Authority, Dr. Machel Emanuel, members of our listening and viewing audience, both present and online, good evening. We are here to explore a very exciting topic, medicinal cannabis as a driver for sustainable development for small Caribbean island states. Over the next 2 hours, we will look at how this emerging sector can contribute to economic growth, policy innovation, and social development in our region. As we begin, it's my honor to invite the CEO of the Medicinal Cannabis Authority, Nadiv Mills, to share some brief remarks and set the stage for today's discussion.
Thank you, Ms. Burridge. Pleasant good evening to one and all. As CEO, it is an honor for me to welcome you to tonight's public lecture. Our purpose today is to educate. We are here to explore a national strategy, a carefully calibrated approach to transforming a historically stigmatized plant into a legitimate driver of health, equity, and economic resilience. For small island states like ours, the classic development paths are often fraught with vulnerability. We face unique challenges: economic volatility, climate sensitivity, and a pressing need for sustainable livelihoods. This brings us to our theme today: medicinal cannabis as a driver for sustainable development for small Caribbean island states. This conversation is about job creation in science, research, and technology. It is about health sovereignty, offering our citizens alternative therapies while building legitimate wealth in our economy. It is about designing an industry rooted in social equity, ensuring that the communities most impacted by the past can be stakeholders in the future. Most important to me is the strengthening of our agriculture sector. As we know, the skills acquired in the medicinal cannabis industry will be transferable to food crop farming. To guide us through this multifaceted opportunity, we are privileged to have a speaker of exceptional caliber. Our featured speaker, Dr. Machel Emanuel, is a senior lecturer and researcher in the Department of Life Sciences at the University of the West Indies, Mona Campus, Jamaica. He is the principal investigator of the Life Science Cannabis Research Group. In his research, he conducts research in cannabis reform policy for the Caribbean region and the application, efficacy, and quality assurance of tropical horticulture for the production of cannabis sativa. He collaborates with the Humboldt Seed Company in the development of cannabis germplasm suited for equatorial cultivation. This research group has also received grant funding from BioBiz Worldwide Organics in advancing sustainable and environmentally friendly practices from cannabis production. Dr. Emanuel is the Vice Chair of the Bureau of Standards Jamaica Cannabis Technical Committee for the development of standards for the Jamaica cannabis industry. He was appointed technical advisor, consultant for the government of the Commonwealth of Dominica for the establishment of regulated cannabis industries. Dr. Emanuel was listed in Leaf Nation 2024 Impact List as one of the individuals making an impact in the cannabis world. So, it is with great personal pleasure and professional respect that I invite to the podium Dr. Emanuel for our keynote address. Help me welcome him.
Good evening, everyone. It's indeed a pleasure to be here in St. Kitts and Nevis, and I welcome the opportunity to pass on my expertise in terms of the development of the sector for the benefit of the people of St. Kitts and Nevis. So I am very thankful to Mr. Mills, who I have been working with closely for the past few months, and I would like to thank Madam Chair, Mrs. Williams, for giving me that opportunity to also pay my respect to the Cannabis Authority for allowing me to contribute in this way. Today, my topic of discussion is medical cannabis as a driver of sustainable development for small developing island states. This puts on a very different hat that I'm usually wearing based on I'm normally talking about plants. So today I'll be talking about the economic side of how cannabis could be a driver and a sustainable developer for the St. Kitts and Nevis economy. So when we look at the global landscape of cannabis, we see that legalization and decriminalization has definitely taken place in the developed world, such as Europe, North America, and Australia. We also see countries like South Africa and South America playing an important role in terms of cannabis reform and propelling the economic value surrounding cannabis production, manufacturing, and dispensing cannabis to consumers. When we look at the global cannabis market, we see that in 2022, the value was over 40 billion United States dollars, and it is expected to grow at a rate of 34.3% to in 2020. In 2030, we expect it to be more than 100 billion US dollars in terms of value and the existence of trading or patterns. We also see the trends moving based on the enabling of cannabis policy and regulatory relaxation coming from the days of prohibition. We also see that the market drivers follow the raw material. It is good to see that within St. Kitts, the authority is placed within the Ministry of Agriculture. So it acknowledged cannabis as an agricultural crop. And we would love to see the emergence of the value-added preposition, such as manufacturing. Also, it's important to understand the phytochemical constituents that the plant produces to be inclusive in terms of the global medicinal market trade. And the applications in terms of cannabis medicine, from recreational to sacramental to adult use cannabis in terms of global dynamics taking place. So when we look at a little breakdown based on the industry's key overview in 2025, we see that the global market size is nearly 40%. And we see that the medical cannabis share is about 25% of that global market share. So medicinal cannabis definitely seems to be one of the main economic drivers for moving cannabis economics globally. We also see the investment capital has been over 100 billion US, and in recent times when the President of the United States descheduled cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, we saw a great confidence in the global market index surrounding cannabis. And the consumer dynamics shows that the millennials and the Gen Zs play a very critical role based on the consumption patterns we see. And these patterns emerge from the consumption of edibles, beverages, which seems to be the fastest growing sector in terms of global medicinal cannabis business. The market growth, so the legal cannabis market is projected to approximately at 47 billion in 2024. And it is expected, as I said, to be more than 100 billion US dollars by 2030. And this represents an annual compounding growth of 14%. So it's important that countries globally look to integrate into the medicinal cannabis framework. And the Caribbean is a very important trading bloc in terms of advancing those policies to enable economic commerce surrounding cannabis policy and legislation. When we look at the regional leaders in our hemisphere, we know that the North America Cannabis Index, which encompasses Canada and North America, seems to remain dominant in terms of accounting for more than 90% of the current market share. Europe seems to be the fastest growing market region in terms of being driven by the medical cannabis proposition and value-added products. In recent times, Europe has engaged in adult use markets such as Germany, Malta, and Czech Republic. I was privileged to be invited by the government of Malta last year to visit, and they have a very interesting model based on the social club model, which brings about membership and providing access to medicinal cannabis patients. So Europe in general is poised to become one of the second largest cannabis markets globally, and we tend to see most of the trade patterns and the export potential being moved towards the European market, particularly Germany. Germany is known to have more than 1 million registered cannabis users, and the pharmaceutical model based on dispensing cannabis has one that has shown a promise based on the commerce activities and the consumer confidence that has been developed through the pharmaceutical markets. We also see where Latin America and the Caribbean region seems to be uniquely poised in solidifying its role as a low-cost production center and an export hub for medicinal cannabis and extracts. Particularly, most of the exports that have taken place from the Caribbean region has gone to Europe. There has been exports to as far as Australia, but Thailand seems to take most of that market share. So St. Kitts has that unique opportunity to present themselves within the value-added proposition in terms of creating an economic pillar and diversifying its agricultural sector in terms of contributing to this export potential. The emerging markets which are there to look out for, as I mentioned, Germany is one of the biggest markets, and the fact that they have allowed adult use consumption in recent times through the social club model, which we see has taken precedence in terms of Europe's model to adult use cannabis. And Germany seems to be the single most significant catalyst in Europe, and it's expected to create that domino effect in terms of setting that precedence for European models to adopt cannabis policies. We see Thailand, after the groundbreaking move to legalize in 2022 without the advent of regulations, seemed to be very promising in the advancement to cannabis policy and using a very different paradigm shift based on not using the regulatory framework which is accustomed to in the Western world. And I had the privilege to visit Thailand, and how it works in that demographics is once you have a certificate for good agricultural collection practices and your place is certified for that perspective, you are allowed to trade within the recreational and medicinal market. So the small man, the large cultivators, the foreign investors all get the opportunity to try at a play to their trade and actually contribute to the commercial activities that take place in terms of Thailand. And because Thailand is a very huge, country with a very large population, that model seems to be working in terms of generating the sort of economic commerce which is proposed in terms of developing cannabis as an economic pillar. We also see in Europe in recent times where Czech Republic and Switzerland both are advancing adult use pilot programs that could serve as models for regulated and regional markets. Mexico is an interesting country in terms of cannabis legislation because despite the delays that we have seen, it is eventually possible the largest adult use market globally based on the population size. But what makes Mexico more interesting is that Mexico has always been a hub for the manufacturing of pharmaceutical drugs. So the ingredients known as APIs, applied pharmaceutical ingredients, could play an important role in the formulations of cannabis medicines. So to have that niche advantage to produce applied pharmaceutical ingredients, such as extracts of the phytochemical constituents, could have a value-added proposition for entering those markets for further manufacturing of value-added goods. So the global medicinal market, the current size, is much smaller than the actual global framework concerning cannabis. And its value is approximately between 16 to 20 billion US estimated in 2023. And this projected growth is expected to grow at a compound annual rate between 12 to 17% over the next decade. So the future value of the medicinal cannabis sector may be projected to reach as much as 45 to 65 billion US dollars, depending on the rate of the country's approval and ability to relax policy legislations and the amount of research breakthroughs in terms of advancing medical pharmacopoeia and more qualifying conditions and the production of value-added products such as transdermal patches, such as medicinal condiments that could have potential benefits for people suffering from particular conditions. And what's make medical cannabis so valuable is the proposition in terms of the aging populations. And these first world countries do have issues with aging populations, with people suffering from dementia-related conditions. And cannabis has proven to treat dementia-related conditions with much less side effects compared to conventional drugs. So the regional market breakdown, where North America still holds majority of the market share. However, within the United States, we know cannabis remains federally illegal, but Canada opening up in 2018 really opened that cannabis index in terms of trade and development of commodities. And that also poses some challenges for places like the Caribbean, where we see the inferior products in terms of what these countries produce are finding themselves to our shores. And this is something that we have to take seriously. Europe, being the fastest growing medicinal cannabis market, with Germany leading in both size and pharmacy-based distribution. The Asian Pacific countries definitely has demonstrated growth, with Thailand being the primary leader in terms of high value and low volume imports into markets like Australia and Israel. So the medicinal market does come with certain challenges. So here are some challenges based on the regulatory fragmentation, where each country tends to develop its own policy, and we know because of the new age dimension in terms of cannabis prohibition and the relaxation of policies, every country has not been able to develop a perfect legislation, but they attempt to develop legislations which tends to represent their local demographics in terms of providing qualifying conditions, product standards, and prescription pathways, which don't seem to be coherent throughout the regulatory framework surrounding medicinal cannabis. We also see issues with integrating cannabis into the medical pharmacopoeia from a medical physician in terms of their previous education and the lack of formal training in understanding the endocannabinoid system and providing cannabinoid therapy as an alternative in terms of prescription-based medicines. So it's important that we could set a particular framework locally that would enhance patient-driven access and allowing your population access to medicinal cannabis for therapeutic benefits. The high patient costs that we see associated with conventional medicine, cannabis provides an alternative. But this alternative does come with some challenges in the essence that insurance companies are not willing to support cannabis-driven medicine currently. So medical cannabis is still within that prohibitive side of things, making access to certain cannabis medical preparations can be quite costly for the average person. We also see that there exists barriers to research, particularly in the United States, where we saw the rescheduling of cannabis from Schedule 1 having no medicinal benefits to Schedule 3, with known medicinal benefits, really creates a good signaling opportunity to create confidence within the investor markets and also consumers who will be visiting our shores from these first world countries. So it poses a good preposition in terms of marketing and providing access for tourist access to access cannabis for these medicinal purposes. We also see correspondent banking as an issue currently that, as most Caribbean countries, banking transactions takes place via U.S. banking systems, but certain countries like St. Vincent have developed where their local banking system has been able to develop corresponding banking relationships from places like Canada, where has relaxed their laws in 2018. And this allows local farmers and players within the cannabis value chain to open bank accounts and also to receive investment funding through these various channels. As we know, cannabis in the Caribbean is one which is deeply culturally rooted, and it is rooted within the Rastafari community, and it provides strong economic roots in the Caribbean region as a sustenance for many subsistence farmers who have been able to cultivate cannabis via the illicit market. We know that comes with a lot of risk, but the risk seems to outweigh the rewards that many of these farmers would have enjoyed in terms of the value proposition of cultivating cannabis under the illicit market. And cannabis has been in the Caribbean for quite some time, from the 1600s when the Spanish conquistadors came here, to the colonial prohibition during the 1900s, to legalization in the 21st century. Caribbean integration, there was an attempt in the 1960s to form the Caribbean Federation, and we know Trinidad and Jamaica was not necessarily found of that preposition, but the Federation was there to facilitate intra-regional trade and to see the Caribbean region as a single trading bloc. And with that, we saw the Caribbean Free Trade Association, known as CARIFTA, being formed in 1968. And that brought about commissioning two ships known as the Federal Palm and the Federal Maple. And these two ships traversed from Guyana to Trinidad all the way to Jamaica, consistently moving goods and services across the Caribbean region. And this was where the first ganja was really seen being exported and entering the Eastern Caribbean shores via these two commercial ships moving through the Caribbean region. And we also saw cannabis entering the Caribbean via the cement boats, which actually came from Colombia in the 1960s, 1970s. There is a story that I saw where a university student traveling from Jamaica to go to Trinidad for like carnival said that there were like many huge bales of plant matter being loaded onto the boat, and then at a certain time reaching certain ports, they would see men scampering, moving these bales offshore in terms of cannabis trade. So it's important to understand the movement of goods and services, and it's well known that cannabis is probably the most intra-regionally traded horticultural commodity and catches the highest economic value in its raw state. So in the Caribbean demographics, we actually traditionally have producer countries such as Jamaica, St. Vincent, Dominica, that produce way more cannabis than their local population can actually consume. And then we have well-known consumer markets such as Barbados, Antigua, possibly St. Kitts and Nevis too, and St. Martin, and all the smaller tourist-oriented countries. So when we look at the current landscape surrounding cannabis reform policy, we can boast of 10 years of relaxed cannabis legislation, with Jamaica leading the charge in 2015. And I have been privileged to live there and see what has taken place over the 10 years. And it's interesting to note that the development and the preposition of their regulatory framework is one which is not perfect, but it has somewhat granted 169 licenses across various different tiers and categories today, and saw a huge investor confidence prior to COVID and after COVID, based on the Canadian market being dried up based on the investor confidence, where 47% of cannabis companies filed for bankruptcy. That saw a diminish in the foreign investment capital, which was initially projected in terms of Jamaica's preposition. Then we see Belize, St. Vincent, Antigua, Trinidad, Barbados, Dominica, St. Kitts, Guyana, St. Lucia, Bahamas, USVI, and the newest kid on the block is Grenada, which just decriminalized cannabis 2 weeks ago. But it's important to note here that countries have taken different routes in terms of relaxing cannabis policy, from decriminalization only to developing medicinal cannabis programs without decriminalization. We also see where Antigua took the bold move to include the religious freedom aspect of sacramental rights into their regulatory framework, also supporting medicinal cannabis development. So it's important to note that whilst countries have taken different models, it still demonstrates the three main pillars in terms of cannabis reform policy, from integrating into the global medicinal cannabis market and providing social equity and restorative justice for persons who would have been victimized in the illicit market, and to provide the Rastafari and indigenous communities with religious freedom and ceremonial rights. So far, the Caribbean has developed 6 cannabis authorities: Jamaica, St. Vincent, Antigua, Barbados, St. Kitts, and St. Lucia. What we see is that the modus operandi, or the vision set by these governments, seem to be somewhat different based on the area that these cannabis authorities are currently being housed. So in Jamaica, we see it's in the Ministry of Investment and Commerce, similar to St. Lucia, which is in the Ministry of Commerce, Manufacturing and Business Development. And that shows the indication of more looking towards a foreign direct investment model and how that could be managed from a national point of view to enact the development of a cannabis value chain supported by cultivation. We see where St. Vincent and St. Kitts really has looked at the proposition of cannabis as an agricultural crop first, where raw material is always king and the spin-offs based on processing, manufacturing, value-added proposition comes after that. And in the developing world, agro-processing is a hallmark of development and moving forward with the sustainable goals set by the United Nations. So we also see where Barbados looked into the Ministry of Agriculture and Food Security. However, Barbados has taken a very different perspective in terms of cannabis policy reform. We're looking at the proposition of a strict pharmaceutical model where smoking and inhalation remains illegal. So that pretty much slows down the economic proposition in terms of the Caribbean being still a flower-oriented market where buds and smoking is still the main commerce activity from the local population. So in recent times, Barbados had to find certain loopholes to introduce pre-rolls in terms of their market distribution. Just to mention in St. Lucia Authority is named the Regulated Substance Abuse, and they have taken a slightly different model where encompassing all substances that would enable regulations, such as pharmaceutical drugs, such as other regulatory authorities in terms of managing petrol, so on. So it is not just strictly cannabis, but it entails many other jurisdictions over other products and goods. So when we look at the regional models being proposed at a glance, we see where countries such as Jamaica use cultural integrated models as their focus in terms of using their heritage, in terms of their cultural significance to advance their brand at Jamaica. And we see where that has brought about the sustainable development goals of 8 and 10, where the job creation, inclusion, and the inclusiveness of growth via GDP, via integrating a medicinal cannabis sector. We see where Antigua Barbuda brought about a rights integrated model where medicinal was balanced with sacramental cannabis being housed under the Medical Cannabis Authority, and that addresses Sustainable Development Goals 10 and 16, where the proposition of reducing inequalities and social justice by providing a level playing field for persons both locally and who have been marginalized under the prohibition era. We also see where St. Vincent has not decriminalized cannabis, but have solely looked to develop an export-oriented model via the manufacturing and exporting of medicinal cannabis products. And we see where that meets the Sustainable Development Goals 8 and 12, where economic growth and responsible cannabis production via job creation has been their main propositions. Barbados, as I mentioned, took about the model of looking at cannabis from a pharmacopoeia point of view, from medicinal excellence and the development of pharmaceutical and supporting research via initiatives. And that looks at Sustainable Development Goals 3 and 9 based on the innovation and the prospects of health, management, and, providing high quality products that meets safety standards for both tourists and the local population. So St. Kitts and Nevis, it's interesting to see that St. Kitts and Nevis has, developed a dual pathway model with the inclusion of a medicinal cannabis sector, but recognizing that sacramental recognition is important, particularly what took place with the Sankofa case, where the rights of a human being needs to be adhered to based on the preposition of rights to freedom in terms of religion. And that seems to address Sustainable Development Goals 8, 10, 16, and 15, where the projection of growth in terms of the sustainability of an agricultural commodity, but also providing equity and equality for persons who are willing to participate within the regulatory framework. So looking at the UN Sustainable Development Goals and building a more sustainable and equitable future for our Caribbean region. So Sustainable Development Goal 8, where decent work and economic growth. So every Caribbean model has the preposition of creating jobs and existing within a vertically integrated cannabis value chain from production to manufacturing to distribution. And whilst St. Vincent shows an export potential model, Jamaica has demonstrated that cultural tourism could also bring sustainable economic revenue to sustaining the cannabis model by providing access to your tourist arrivals. So it's important where St. Kitts could definitely build on both these models. When we look at Sustainable Development Goal 10, where the reduced inequalities, where Antigua pretty much has set the trend for integrating rights into law for the everyday person, whereas Jamaica created tier systems for small farmers to be able to get access to production in terms of integrating themselves within the cannabis supply chain. So for St. Kitts and Nevis, this means ensuring both sacramental and economic rights provide access to economic stimulation. So sacramental rights does have the opportunity to provide certain models for tourist access to tours and development of value-added goods from a cultural perspective. And the medicinal cannabis will definitely provide more economic sustenance by value-added prepositions. So when we move on and look at Sustainable Goal Development 12, we see responsible consumption and production, where St. Vincent built an export-oriented industry based on standards integrated into their framework, but Barbados took on to emphasize the pharmaceutical quality. So St. Kitts can now choose sustainable cultivation from the start and learn from these countries how to integrate these models to sort of develop sustainability by developing an integrated cannabis supply chain. Sustainable Goal Development 5, where life on land for small developed island states does have its vulnerabilities, such as hurricanes and natural disasters. But sustainable agriculture is not an option. It is an essential part of growing the economy. So cannabis can be part of a climate resilient and soil eco-friendly farming systems, which could look to bring some marketing prepositions such as eco-friendly, organic production, sun-grown, and these are some of the marketing prepositions that we see the first world countries that don't have access to sunlight and soil as we do. So the niche market presents itself to integrate into these global markets from developing quality assurance mechanisms, which will manage our cultivation, processing, and manufacturing. So the regional sustainable development goal opportunities presents itself by learning from each other and the Caribbean nations from a collective standpoint to advance the global goals while building industries suited for our unique island context. When we look in terms of this particular graph, where we see the contribution of the agricultural sector has continuously declined over the past couple decades, and we know that this comes from when banana was seen to be our main economic driving force in terms of agricultural production. But when the WTO saw that a single market and don't allow us to have preferential treatment to the European market, that sort of decimated the agricultural sector and the productivity that we saw particularly in the 1980s. But research coming out from St. Vincent has demonstrated that the value of the seizures associated from illicit cannabis production could outweigh the economic value which was seen in bananas in the 1980s. So it is no doubt that the value proposition that cannabis provides as a horticultural commodity does provide a serious economic stimulus in terms of value. When we look at the average annual growth in terms of Caribbean economies, this is pretty old, from 2000 to 2019, but it's interesting to note that St. Kitts and Nevis stands head-to-head with Latin America and the Caribbean based on their growth projection rate of around 3.5% growth. And this is very encouraging, and this should be used as some leverage to create that investor confidence, to develop the infrastructure, the technical competence, and provide certain training protocols to advance the technologies that we see to create more efficient and sustainable production in terms of agricultural production, which could be transferred into cannabis production as well. And the hallmark of a developing nation is the ability to integrate agricultural production into its value-added proposition by manufacturing and processing goods. When we look at the potential strengths and barriers in terms of the cannabis industry in the region, there are certain barriers such as the legal and regulatory environments that we face based on many laws, such as, for example, here, the Proceeds of Crimes Act, where money made from illicit cannabis production should actually belong to the state and can be confiscated. So now, cannabis being a gazetted crop, how do we amend certain legislations also, like the Agricultural Act, to make cannabis a gazetted crop to provide extension services and training via the ministry's agriculture framework? And we also see the susceptibility to natural disasters. So to be able to create shocks, to be able to manage. Recently, we saw in terms of Jamaica, where Hurricane Melissa devastated many cannabis production areas, and that saw a shortage in terms of cannabis demand and supply, and that pretty much drove up the local cost of cannabis locally. We also see we are limited medicinal cannabis access, and we want to ensure that the right signaling messages are sent to the wider population to understand the benefits and annoyances in terms of cannabis as a therapeutic substance. So the uncertain international demand also creates uncertainty based on the international conventions that we are signature to. But it's important to note that no Caribbean country has been written up for non-compliance by the International Narcotics Board of Control. So that means we have not really been able to push at the barriers enough to demonstrate our originality in terms of developing cannabis industries, and we are simply left to exploit the medicinal cannabis sector that pretty much has half the value of the global medicinal cannabis sector. And we know that the access in terms of adult use cannabis would, be able to provide that economic sustenance by providing easier access without barriers to purchasing cannabis via the conventional medicinal challenges that we face currently. So the strengths are our location is extremely favorable for the cultivation of sustainable cannabis utilizing the solar radiation from the sun, which we have 365 days of the year. So in first world countries, sun-grown cannabis seems to be way more expensive than controlled atmospheric conditions in terms of cultivating cannabis. And research has also demonstrated that cannabis grown in the natural sunlight demonstrates a more holistic product by the production of a lot more minor cannabinoids and phytochemicals that actually provide a more holistic approach towards healing. Also, the access to low-cost labor and land is a value-added proposition that we have, and the ability to attract foreign direct investment to our shores. So, what are the key market growth and economic potential in terms of exploring the aspects of medicinal cannabis? One is the ability to integrate into the global medicinal pharmacopoeia with patient-driven access and the value-added proposition of cannabis products, the local demand and consumption, driving throughout St. Kitts. I see very persuasive use in terms of cannabis usage. So the quality assurance to educate the public to understand what is the difference between quality assurance and public health and safety in administering cannabis to your public, and to allow patient-driven access to particularly the elderly population that suffers from dementia-related conditions. Also, the proposition of wellness and the tourism sector. The development of cannabis-friendly resorts provides experiences for tourists who are willing to patronize cannabis in that way. Provision of farm tours, culinary events, and events such as the music festival and so on could have designated areas that would support cannabis consumption via enjoying a night of musical ambience. So, and also the export opportunities, such as the proposition for high quality sun-grown cannabis, which actually could be exported to international markets, and the production of value-added products. So the opportunities for growth sit within the medical and wellness tourism, local cultivation and craft cannabis products, the value-added products for export potential, such as oils, edibles, topicals, and the opportunity to attract persons to your shores to provide research and biotechnology development, such as partnerships with universities and pharmaceutical companies. So now I'm going to look at three or four papers that I have published looking at cannabis policy regionally. And the first one is Policy Analysis and Implications of Establishing a Caribbean Cannabis Economy and Lessons from Jamaica. So whilst governments are faced with the complex task of balancing the emerging medicinal cannabis market and formalizing the existing illegal trade, that demonstrates two separate models that needs to be established to demonstrate some level of coherence in terms of approach to policy. And that is something that I saw somewhat lacking in the legislation here, where the access of a social equity model for how the average person or the marginalized people would have access to participate in the regulatory framework without the same barriers to entry. We also see where the laws pertaining to sacramental purposes remains pretty unclear and gray based on the avenues for production, processing, consumption, and development of cannabis byproducts. And we know the Rastafari community has been the stewards based on craft production of developing cannabis products based on the limited access to manufacturing protocols that they would have. So we also see where the laws and regulations governing the legal cannabis industry with linkages supporting cultivation, processing, packaging, transportation, retail are clear, but laws surrounding purchasing, consumption, advertising, marketing are not, are not very clear. And this is important because these propositions do bring about and marketing the economic commercial activities which would make the industry viable as an economic prospect. So second paper, looking at the issues in establishing a therapeutic cannabis market under the amendment to the Dangerous Drug Act in 2015. And we observed that there were problematic relationships that engage within key government agencies, such as the Ministry of Health and other agencies and ministries within the government framework that have an overriding role to play in the regulatory framework, the gazetting of cannabis products, so on. So there needs to be some level of understanding and resource sharing and coherence in developing an integrated approach to how these agencies and ministries will engage in this new development of a cannabis sector. We also see where the Ministry of Health, because of the number of roles it has to play in the therapeutic cannabis regime, such as the approval of nutraceutical products, pharmaceutical products under the Food and Drug Act, even issuing permits for tourists who wish to access cannabis, and to provide the general oversight over the medicinal professionals who issue cannabis recommendations for consumers to access legal cannabis. So we see that the role that the Ministry of Health has to play, they have to be on board in terms of supporting the demographics moving forward for the development of this sector. We also see that the Dangerous Drug Act reform has facilitated the elements of commoditizing cannabis versus via a vertically integrated cannabis industry from production to consumption via international investments. But this somewhat left at the expense of leveraging Jamaica's cultural reputation and artisanal production. So the indigenous knowledge of cannabis production pretty much has been overlooked by the foreign direct investment model, and the efficiency, the technologies, the strains pretty much have been dominated from other first world countries such as Europe and the United States. Thirdly, foreign investment in the emerging legal medicinal cannabis market. And this is something that seems to be very ticklish in terms of various jurisdictions where they don't want to see the proposition of the market being captured by the foreign direct investment model. So we see where the local industries and public officials saw foreign direct investment as an essential source of capital to finance the startup costs for developing medicinal cannabis businesses. The foreign investors were able to provide Jamaican entrepreneurs with access to cultivation technologies, business knowledge that increased efficiency in terms of production mechanisms in the cannabis sector. We also saw where the international investors were able to exert influence on local companies, for example, developing strategic structuring of shareholder agreements where majority of the money made is not going to remain within the local shores. So while the upper and middle class has been able to forge these partnerships with international companies, the traditional cultivators have been left to be exploited by unfavorable programs set up by governments such as the Alternative Development Model. Finally, this paper looks towards the social justice and economic empowerment, exploring Jamaica's progress with implementing cannabis law reform. And what we saw is between 2014, in the first year of relaxing cannabis laws, cannabis-related arrests dropped by 77% from 10,223 to 2,389 persons were arrested in the first year. So that shows a dramatic shift to enforcing cannabis prohibition policy based on criminalizing persons for participating in the cannabis supply chain, both from an illicit point of view. We also saw where the expungements of criminal records for minor offenses, such as possession but not cultivation, also saw about 4,000 expungements taking place within the first 2 years. So the information gathered during research definitely suggests that the licenses came from the overwhelming from the Jamaican business class rather than the small-scale subsistence farming background and grassroots people. So the transition from the illegal cultivation to the legal therapeutic cannabis enterprise appears to be too erroneous for many farmers who may also see little incentive in transitioning into the legal space. So when we look in terms of developing a cannabis supply chain, quality and public health and safety becomes paramount. So the ability to participate within the regulated framework supports a business proposition based on compliance. So to facilitate that, the seed to sale must be documented based on record keeping and tracking the life cycle of the cannabis plant to ensure inversion and diversion does not take place, and to also ensure that the product quality maintains. The product quality is important in terms of creating that consumer confidence, and also the medicinal practitioners need to be able to trust the products that are being developed. So until the final product is packaged and sold, information needs to flow up the value chain in terms of data, and we also need to see the support linkages that will support the auxiliary companies and the economic commerce, such as manufacturing, packaging, and distribution. So external partners within the Cannabis Regulatory Authority is important based on a collaborative perspective. So law enforcement must collaborate with the police and customs to ensure what the enforcement mechanisms and the tribunals are being heard in a fair and timely manner. We also see where the customs and excise needs to ensure that the protection of the agricultural sector from bringing certain pests and compromise diseases in the country are left to a minimal risk. So the agricultural agencies also need to provide the level of extension services that would be required for production of any agricultural crop. The health agencies need to address the medicinal cannabis programs and from a public health perspective to ensure that these products are indeed safe and would be able to meet demands of a mandatory and voluntary recalls. The drug abuse agencies need to send the right signaling and public education and awareness to address the pros and cons of cannabis consumption. The parish councils needs to coordinate the zoning for distribution and in the production areas, such as not, being close to a school or a church of that sort. Then the education and training is critical to be able to facilitate the competence and certification which is needed in terms of developing that human competence that will participate in the regulatory framework. So interministerial coordination for like cannabis regulation is important to understand the regulatory mapping, to be able to identify all the touch points between the medicinal and sacramental framework, to be able to map the inspection and enforcement jurisdictions, to develop protocols for interagency coordination and activities, to provide information sharing and mechanisms, to establish dispute resolution processes while implementing planning by assigning lead agencies for each regulatory function, develop joint training calendars, and actually create a public communication plan. So in summary, the Cannabis Act of 2020 establishes a comprehensive and conservative and highly regulated model for a medicinal cannabis program. It prioritizes patient safety, medicinal oversight, and strict supply control through a central authority known as the Cannabis Authority. So the act is designed to create a legal industry while aggressively preventing diversion, misuse, inversion, and leveraging lessons from other jurisdictions within a framework tailored to the national context of St. Christopher and Nevis. The Rastafari Rights and Recognition Act of 2023 represents a significant step towards religious inclusion and cultural recognition in St. Christopher and Nevis, balancing the spiritual freedom with regulatory oversight. So looking at just a quick legal comparison matrix that exists within these two bills, we see where the Cannabis Act, the Medicinal Act, supports all parts of the plant and its derivatives. But in the Rastafari Act, it does not necessarily support the manufacturing of cannabis derivatives, such as concentrates and a development of cannabis products via craft production. And this sort of creates enforcement confusion based on managing these two models in separate ministries. We also see where the authorized locations, such as the registered places for medicinal use, such as the lounges and private residence, is clear under the 2020 Act, but the registered place of assembly for sacramental use is somewhat not clear through the acquisition through the faith-based ministry. And this may cause potential dual registration conflicts. So I would recommend housing everything related to cannabis under the authority, which would not make that dual registration conflict a preposition. So the authorization documents under the 2020 Act, the medicinal cannabis ID card or certificate that will provide a consumer access to be able to purchase cannabis. However, under the Rastafari Act, the group registration certificate remains somewhat blurred as to how will the membership be managed based on this group registration certificate. And also there are Rastafari individuals that don't necessarily belong to any registered group, and how would they be able to participate? Would they be forced to join recognized groups, or would they be remained a marginalized community? So this is two distinct systems that don't demonstrate cohesion to policy development. We also see where the cultivation rights, such as the license holders under the 2020 Act versus the registered group members at the assembly site. How is this site going to be treated based on ceremonial events if a event has to move to the beach or to move to a different location? How will cannabis be managed and moved from location to location? These things remain unclear. So the enforcement authority, we know that the authority will have its own inspectors, which would manage the inventory or record the inventory of these licensing companies. And the police will have to provide some sort of service based on non-compliance and breaking the law via inversion and diversion. But under the Rastafari Act, that is more so under the Attorney General's chambers and the faith-based ministry in terms of how would they coordinate and manage such protocols of inversion and diversion and fraudulent activities within the Rastafari Act. So coordination protocols is very much required to make the playing field a lot more level for the persons who will be participating. So the Caribbean cannabis economy, we know the Caribbean archipelago is one which is very unique in its biogeography and its socioeconomic demographics. So, as I said, cannabis is the most intra-regionally traded horticultural crop, and we know in 2026, intra-regional trade is really low, and cannabis provides a unique opportunity, particularly within the OECS, for the development of value-added products that could be distributed within a single market economy. So enacting progressive cannabis legislation across all territories is definitely a complex issue given the interconnectedness of trade patterns between countries and the wider globe. We also see where the dumping of inferior cannabis products onto the Caribbean shores from North America poses serious risk and implications for development and commercial activities. In conclusion, an integrated approach to developing domestic cannabis economies within Caribbean territories, from policy and legal framework, from the historical and cultural experience, from businesses, marketing, science, and medicinal points of view, are extremely necessary to propel the industry forward. Therefore, academic institutions, the public and private sector definitely need to coordinate to facilitate the research and much needed funding to be able to provide greater understanding of the backward, forward, and cross linkages of the cannabis value chain. Thank you very much.
Thank you to Dr. Emanuel for that insightful presentation. We now have the opportunity to engage with Dr. Emanuel during our question and answer session. We will ask persons with questions to step forward to the mic. The mic will be in the middle right here, and you may ask your questions.
Good evening. I'll move the cobwebs out of the way because the first question is usually, people usually, relax after the first question. Dr. Emanuel, right now in our supermarkets, you see products that are distinctly marked for export. Products that include chemicals or components that are banned in the US, but they are sold here in St. Kitts and Nevis. So as you ended on the topic of the dumping of inferior goods, what sort of strategies, legislatively, practically, can be implemented to ensure that there is no dumping of inferior cannabis products?
Yes, thank you very much for that question, Madam Chair. And it's an important topic to look at. It's not an easy sell because we know that products will definitely be able to find their ways into the shore via very complex trade routes, right? We know we have the Chinese, we have the Indians in the Caribbean region currently, and they are very skilled based on their trade patterns in terms of allowing certain products to enter various shores. But it's up to the public to be able to provide that stewardship based on identifying certain products which are sold and to engage the Bureau of Standards based on providing that overarching regulatory oversight based on public health and safety, packaging, labeling, and the ingredients in terms of products which are entering the shores locally. Because I believe in conjunction with the Bureau and the Ministry of Health, the adverse, complex realities that public health and safety could be at risk based on the entry and consumption of these products, does pose serious risk to our productivity locally. So the Bureau and other regulatory agencies would have to be able to provide that stewardship in terms of managing and partnering with the customs exercise to ensure that these inferior products remain outside of our shores.
Greetings to the floor. Dr. Emanuel, your presentation was very highly. It's good to hear such vast knowledge coming from you as a lecturer. This was very good.
Thank you.
You was talking about the Rastafari Act and base faiths and groups concerning licensing. But I, as an individual Rastaman, I always have a problem with that legislation because we cannot look at the legislation from a group perspective pertaining Rastafari, because we know Rastafari is a calling, and the individual, not because the individual may not be within a group, that cannot say if he apply for a license, he cannot get it. I think that's something that should be looked within, that's there within the law. And we talk about some the weaknesses concerning the legislation as well. You also said in your early presentation that you working amongst the agriculture department. Within your eyesight, seeing that you see the plants that they grow and everything, did you see any example of marijuana production per se, to say, well, the department is setting an example to enhance that type of industry? That's the question I ask.
All right. Thank you very much. And yes, we understand that under the Rastafari Rights and Recognition Act, it provides the opportunity for every individual to have freedom to consciousness, right? And should have access to the cannabis plant. And provisions were made that every household could have the prospects of cultivating 5 plants. And we know that 5 plants is extremely limited based on propagating 5 plants, vegetating 5 plants, flowering 5 plants, right? And it could be 5 males, it could be 5 hermaphrodites, and you may have your 5 plants and really not get to the therapeutic value or the commercial value of the prospects of cultivating your 5 plants. So we see where that opportunity does present challenges, particularly in a Rastafari home, where we know Rastafari persons tend to have large extended families also, right? So I believe that some preposition could be implemented to look at if a householder wants to cultivate more than 5 plants, they could get an exemption from the authority or the ministry based to actually achieve those prospects. Because right now, research has definitely shown that even the vegetative plant being used in smoothies and stuff does have economic value. So think of your 5 seedlings being used in a smoothie in the morning is pretty much done, right? So, and we also know that the management of these 5 plants could be very limited based on the prospects of the economic value that these plants usually possess. And people who grow cannabis knows that most times you're gonna germinate more than 5 plants because you may get males or hermaphrodites, and that would limit you to be able to move forward to the next cycle in terms of flowering plants. You mentioned in terms of the act being limited and not all Rastas fall under the umbrella of Bobo Shanti, Naya Bingi, 12 tribes. And because Rastafari is such a new dimension from the 1930s, it's just approaching over 100 years. So the evolving of Rastafari ideologies and perspectives are young and consistently evolving. So we see the need for more collaboration in terms of to exploit the economic prospects surrounding cannabis production and the value-added proposition of goods and services. And the fact that Rastafari do have that experience and cultural leverage in terms of cultivating cannabis, consuming cannabis, and making craft products. We also know that the cultural emblem that the Rastafari flag flies that attracts persons of interest, such as tourists who will be willing to patronize certain aspects of your culture visiting here. So I see it as an important strategy based on the inclusiveness of the preposition under the act to enable maybe not direct commerce via selling cannabis, but no one stops you from receiving a donation from a non-governmental organization point of view. And what makes it even more difficult is that the Rastafari community has developed a level of trust within the communities that they live in, and they have developed very niche and integrated markets for persons who have the confidence in purchasing and consuming cannabis grown by them based on their ethical and moral concerns, such as not using pesticides, organic nutrients, so on. So the proposition is not to necessarily take away that market from the Rastafari community, but allow it to be managed in a more meaningful way.
I give thanks to the Almighty Father who manifests through Yahshua Emanuel the Messiah and Empire Selassie the first. We give thanks to the glory of the Most High every time, Dr. Emanuel, I just have to just say thank you very much. My heart is very pleased to see that you're the one who's here to make this thing happen. And I know it's going to be a reality now for sure, because the essence of the Most High is in this thing. So, being no more question for the eye. I've been questioning you for a while. I just would love for you to come and see the farm and speak to the other virgins them so they could see the level of knowledge, the impetus, and the vibes that they have still. And the knowledge, man, because the knowledge there, And I give thanks still for the CEO, first time meeting him. So I would also like to invite him to the farm when you come in still, and I'm going to be honest, I mean, the rest of them is there still, but I can't really bring a free lunch for everyone. So for sure, the two of the items, we could sit down and reason and have this. But if the rest of them come and they would want to have lunch, it's going to be hard for me to just provide. Just like that, I would have to consult management. But for sure, if the whole committee want to come, I would invite them still, because we could just give them a small tour and show them the product that we have to offer. We give thanks. So there's an invitation before you leave. Please try to do that if it's possible. Thank you very much for everything,
Yeah, man. Thank you very much. I'm very humbled by your kind words. We know we stand on the shoulders of our elders who have really gone through the brunt of victimization, persecution, and if it was not for the elder communities within the Rastafari community, I could not stand up here today and be the person that I am based on the foundation that the Rastafari community has endured me through my developmental years. And I'm very much appreciated for that. Thank you.
Good night, everybody. Um, First question. I must see a disconnect with the indoor weed versus the sun-grown weed when it's going to have challenges when it comes to most cultivators because of the restrictions and the regulations it has to go through. Most of us who grow weed or smoke weed, grow up on weed, smoke sun-grown weed. So when you're saying like oh, contaminants and what's not and what's not, we survived all these years. So no illegal word, clean weed, and you gotta go through all this thing. Like I don't see it as fear for us.
Yeah, well, you will be very surprised that maybe what you're smoking all these years may have been contaminated, you know?
That's what I
So
mean.
to educate yourself based on the issues and the complexities in terms of cannabis contamination is something that we all need to learn from, right? And just yesterday, looking at samples, right off the bat, I saw microplastics and fungal masses, and inhaling those things into your lungs, not necessarily one time, but consistently over the years, could have serious detrimental effects to your human health. And because cannabis is now seen in the light as a medicinal and therapeutic substance, the quality assurance mechanisms to ensure public health and safety is indeed paramount in terms of protecting the consumer from the ills of cannabis consumption via contamination. And this is a huge reality that I even had to learn from based on adjusting certain cultivation styles and mechanisms post-harvest, fertigation, fertilizer regimes, understanding the shift to more safer pesticide use of biological pesticides, when to apply certain applications throughout the life cycles to minimize certain contamination possibilities. And this is the decision that the consumer is going to be faced with. Do I now purchase something which I know has gone through certain quality assurance mechanisms versus risk the opportunity of consuming something that may be contaminated?
So my point is no, since you explain like that. So why the health officials and department don't have that kind of energy when it comes to cigarettes and alcohol beverages and what's not, even though they put a label in there. It's sold everywhere.
Yeah, well, tobacco and alcohol has been around for some time. And in terms of the packaging, the labeling, the warning, particularly on cigarettes, if you ever read the labeling, you will never smoke a cigarette,
Exactly.
right? Because we all know tobacco smoking causes cancer, right? And as I always mention, you don't make tobacco tea, It's not an aromatic plant. And knowing that Haile Selassie banned tobacco in Ethiopia, that's a very significant step to understand the negatives associated with human health. I know consuming tobacco. And we know it's a cultural thing that people blend tobacco with, cannabis. And even throughout my research, we have seen higher incidences of, tobacco mosaic viruses on, cannabis plants based on the proximity where a tobacco is cultivated and, cannabis, or the farmer is a tobacco smoker where he would build his spliff, handle tobacco, and then go and touch his plants. So those things pose risk even to the sector moving forward to understand productivity mechanisms in terms of providing the public with high quality cannabis products, for the local and the export market. And I don't like the notion that we always lower our standards for local consumption, but we are willing to meet all the high expectations of the export market. And I feel that you have to protect what is yours first before thinking of treating others outside of your local demographics.
One more question. How do you feel about new smokers, younger generation smoking weed products like 25%, 30% THC?
Adolescents really should not engage in smoking cannabis because research has definitely shown that the issues surrounding with the development of your brain, particularly the frontal cortex, which deals with higher thinking and cognitive capabilities, we have seen where, particularly with the new age of the sort of breeding, selective breeding that has taken place, where we see the psychoactive component of cannabis has been inflated extremely high. And this could cause serious detrimental effects, particularly to an adolescent person who has not developed purpose in life. I always say if an adolescent becomes dependent on cannabis, that poses a serious problem, that every activity that they want to partake in, they believe they have to be under the influence of cannabis to actually do that. So that's why becoming an adult and having responsibilities allows you to develop a sort of responsible use and a sort of cannabis ethic based on how you use cannabis, where you get your cannabis from, and the times of day that you will generally consume cannabis for. So in terms of the adolescent population, they need to be protected by all costs, because we know cannabis is a psychotropic substance and it can bring about dependency. But just to note, research has definitely shown that under particular channels through the regulatory framework, adolescents also need to have access to medicinal cannabis products, such as epilepsy, such as ADA, such as various conditions that adolescents may face. Cannabis has shown and proven to provide alleviation to certain symptoms and allow that individual to live a more normal life with the advent of cannabis medicine.
Yes, I just wanted to touch on your first point about the outdoor sun-grown issue. It has been brought up in many of our discussions with the general public, so we already know that it is an issue. And after dealings and guidance from Dr. Emanuel, he has expressed how that is our value proposition, to plant sun-grown cannabis. And it also speaks to the sustainability aspect of this as well. Planting outdoor, is less energy, less electricity used, less resources. That's a sustainable practice. And also for the longevity of this industry, planting outdoors gives us a competitive advantage. So that is another thing that we want to capitalize on.
Yeah, and just to add, most of our indigenous knowledge has been practiced on using the elements of nature to groom and produce cannabis. So we don't want to reinvent the wheel, particularly where production is concern, because we believe that in order to get the youths particularly back into agriculture, cannabis is one of the avenues that would be able to actually do that.
It was good to hear you expound on the history of the federal maple and the federal palm. I remember those years when you started to talk about it.
I wasn't born yet,
I know that. I was born.
Right,
I myself see them.
So tell us a little bit. So you know of the trade taking place, and I'm sure you would have gotten cannabis from the federal palm and federal maple.
Many times, some of our brethren go to Jamaica, and we look forward to see the boat coming in. And
Nice.
we know when the boat comes in, something coming to the shore. So
Nice, nice,
that's why I
nice.
could attest
Yes,
to the
yes, yes. Give
comments that
thanks,
you
give
make.
thanks.
We have the CEO of the agriculture, and I asked you the question this evening, but I didn't really hear you comment on it. In your presentation with the agricultural department, do you see
Yes.
the agriculture department implementing the growing of marijuana to say that they are showing an example towards the industry?
Yeah, well, particularly because the authority lies under the agriculture ministry, right? We understand that there may be some amendments that might have to be done to the Agricultural Act to allow cannabis as a gazetted crop, but I definitely see that it is a role that the agriculture ministry has an important role to play, particularly in ensuring that the clean planting material of cannabis seeds, seedlings, tissue culture be available to the wider public to plant without the possibilities of, having the disease plants, right? And the ability to provide extension services where needed within the agricultural sector, because a cannabis has to be treated as an agricultural crop, because without the biomass production, the value chain cannot move forward. So it is very prudent on the administrators within the agriculture ministry and the agriculture sector to ensure that they even educate themselves a little bit more and visit certain conferences and training programs to broaden their perspective and horizon based on understanding cultivation techniques and mechanisms for ensuring environmental stewardship is maintained throughout the production protocols of cannabis.
Greetings, everybody. Blessed love. Um, Listening to the presentation, right? We observe that the different islands adopting different models,
Yes.
which mean they would have different regulatory frameworks. How would that affect the Caribbean on a
Yeah.
whole? And
Yes.
one more. Looking at the monitor and observing from the 2020 Act and the 2023 Act, we see conflicting wordings. So I'm thinking that it's best if we revisit policies and legislations before we commit ourselves to the industry.
Yeah, well, you actually have a good point, but where we are currently at the crossroads, we will definitely be making some recommendations for amendments within the bill moving forward, but we don't see that in terms of hindering the implementation process, because you see the act was passed in 2020 and we are in 2026. That's a 6-year lapse, right? And because the industry is moving so fast and other countries and other trading blocs are enacting cannabis policy, it is only important that we begin to lay the groundwork that would be important for kickstarting the economic commercial activities surrounding cannabis production, particularly to see the plight of sugar that has taken here, and the gross domestic product coming from the contribution of agriculture is at a current minimal. So now we have an alternative to be able to develop and push the agricultural sector and get farmers back into the land via cultivating cannabis, could bring some economic stimulants and productivity to the country of St. Kitts and Nevis. In your second question, where you see that other countries have different policies and acts, yes, we acknowledge that, and what we see is that each country seems to want to develop their own sort of standards and prepositions in terms of cannabis policy legislation, right? And it's a learning curve because we could not get here today if we didn't learn from the mistakes of other jurisdictions. So it is to strengthen one another, particularly we see the OECS as a single trading bloc to be able to provide that intra-regional movement of services and goods coming from like cannabis production, because we know that there will be advantages and disadvantages to certain countries based on productivity, such as cannabis uses a lot of water, so countries like Antigua, who is going to be growing cannabis from desalinated water, is going to have a higher production price point versus a country like Dominica that would have access to surface water, and also the climatic conditions, proximity to the sunset shores versus the Atlantic side, and access to flat land would have advantages based on production. So understanding the issues of intellectual property and geographical indicators could also add value to cannabis being produced in local demographics that would have some marketing value in various jurisdictions, such as back in the day, we all know Jamaican ganja had a thing, and St. Vincent herb had a thing, but now we see each country, even Barbados being Barbados is engaging in production, but they would not be able to compete on certain fronts from other jurisdictions that would have certain niche advantages to more sustainable and cheaper production mechanisms.
Yes, I would just like to echo the same sentiments as Dr. Machel Emanuel. We know that the act is not perfect. There's a lot of things we have issues with. We are committed to make these amendments, but we are also committed to rolling out this industry. We have some people that are already ready. They see opportunity here. We know there is ways that we can make it better, and that is what we will do.
Yeah, bless and love everyone. Yeah, question to you, Emanuel. Your presentation have been very informative and knowledgeable. So I just want to say give thanks,
Give thanks.
Bless and love.
Yes,
yeah, now we have bring the awareness to the herb, whereas growing herb can be contaminated by different mistakes. In terms of the plastic you're talking about and different diseases caused by different various things. Now the awareness here, and we know, because over the years, like we go home and without testing to see where the plastic there or the diseases are there. So now with the awareness, there are going to be programs put in place for those who know about the contaminated. So we wouldn't make the mistake, and when we have plant the herb and we have gone down the gene. And there's going to be a program put in place to bring the awareness, so we wouldn't.
Yes. There will be programs such as building that technical competence in terms of testing protocols. And we also see where facilitating training for cultivators based on good agriculture collection practices is going to be important in terms of building that competence to serve the industry moving forward. We also see where good manufacturing practices and the development of proper infrastructure, which will be needed for storage capabilities, for post-harvest practices, and for the adding of processing, manufacturing is going to be critical to be able to retain value of the cannabis grown on the island and it not just being wasted via original traditional means. So it's important that the technologies, the advancements, the training, the learning, and the education is part of the development process moving forward.
Thank you, Doctor. I'm happy that I came and thank you for the education.
Give thanks.
Is there a lesson that we can learn from bananas? You know, before the liberalization, I'm coming from St. Lucia.
Right.
The banana industry actually
And I'm coming from
created some-
Dominica, just to let you know.
So, and two things just came to my mind, particularly in the cannabis industry. The role of the extension officer or officers or that team in that banana industry was critical.
Yes.
And also when on the other side, the marketing support.
Yes.
And how applicable is that to?
It's very applicable because it's an agricultural commodity. So the same or similar protocols would be able to be developed and propel the industry forward. And we see that the marketing aspect is also very critical from a local and international or regional standpoint, that how are we going to develop products or be able to move this commodity into the marketplace that would have that sort of value proposition. And the extension services, I would assume that the agriculture extension officers would now need to expand their bandwidth and hire particular persons who would have some indigenous knowledge in cultivating cannabis in the illicit market and allow their technical knowledge to be able to contribute on a national level.
Greetings all, and special greetings to Dr. Emanuel. Very good presentation. I have some observations based on the presentation and some of the slides. And my angle is towards cultivation. And coming out of the Jamaican model in one of your slides, you mentioned some challenges in your bullet points that you would have observed under the Jamaican model. Now, as it is now, the Medicinal Cannabis Authority here, we are trying to open up for first phase cultivation. Yes. But in the model that you presented, you saw a trend where individual cultivators, I don't know if you want to call it the small man or the indigenous Rastafari person, but that model showed it was more of the business people. So the question is, how can we as cultivators in St. Kitts, especially to the farmers, for most of them, they have done it as an individual. And coming out of the Jamaican model, which has been in practice before us, we see, if I'm correct, it's not working like that. So what advice can you give to those of us here who really want to push forward in the cultivation? Because I, for one, have said the better approach is group-oriented. Sure. But let's hear from you. You're the learned professor.
Yes, and we would definitely like to strengthen the social equity models that provide the marginalized person or the marginalized individual to be able to get access to ply their trade in a regulated space. What we have seen is that the small man perspective of his participation is owning the value chain. He wants to breed, he wants to grow, he wants to extract, he wants to sell, he wants to distribute, he wants to do everything. In a the success of a cannabis license is not the ability to merely grow, cannabis. It's in an industry that requires compliance. So you want to allow cultivators to be able to cultivate, but you want to allow other individuals to be able to participate from the learned trade, such as record keeping, such as business management, accounting. So it's really a multifaceted industry that would need all hands on deck to be able to support one another to create the viability and the sustenance that would be needed in terms of owning that license that would actually bring that economic value. Because the license in itself, obtaining that license should have a value proposition which could attract investment capital and allow you to generate a sustainable income legally via cultivating cannabis. So it's important to develop relationships from a cooperative standpoint or from an LLC standpoint, a business proposition that could take advantage of owning that license and allow you to make a sustainable livelihood.
To the CEO, am I correct from our last discussion that in terms of sustainability for the farmers, and we're really talking about, if you look at the licensing regime that was presented to us, isn't it more advisable to think of scale so that it's not necessarily one producer, but perhaps 2, 3 producers, and also the size of the farms and whatever?
Yeah, if I may just comment before, and yet that is a very good question because we see the issue of having satellite production mechanisms where you have a centralized post-harvest similar to the banana days where you have centralized post-harvest activities taking place where the quality assurance can be micromanaged from that perspective but allow numerous cultivators to feed into that mother farm system. And we have seen how that has worked in many jurisdictions where cultivation could be handed out, supplying the propagation material, but centralized at the post-harvest and storage activities to be able to maintain value of the crop produced.
Yes, I would just like to agree with Dr. Emanuel. As the authority, we are promoting collaboration, not just because you're one individual grower, you feel like you're really good at it. That means that you have to venture to get this license by yourself. It is better to collaborate with somebody a like mind who could help you in some form of the operation, some part of the operation. And through this collaboration, that is how we see that you will reach success. And not one individual trying to do everything, or one individual trying to do everything within a specific license. As I said, collaboration, you can get it done. Because quality and standards is what will create the value in this industry. So making sure that you could meet these high standards. Because the Act has in pretty high standards, but to export into European markets, the standards are even higher. So when you're going into these licenses, the main thing you have to focus on is quality and meeting the standards.
And just remember that the government has international obligations also, right? Because of the 1961 Convention of Narcotics are in our control. So the ability to provide records of your crop, whereas the government has to report on a monthly and yearly basis to the International Narcotics Board of Control based on the activities that take place within the local jurisdiction, and non-compliance thereof definitely has ramifications and implications for funding and development from these international institutions like the United Nations?
So would it be able for, because when it comes to cultivators, everybody have different techniques and methods and what's not. So it'll be able that each one could have like a small operation, as you say, but they have a like under one license, but the size of the land and just make up into whichever license.
Yes, there is a possibility for that. You could enter into the cultivation license as an individual or business entity. The scenario that you described, you should enter into it on a business LLC or partnership. And then through the property facility diagrams, you can clearly outline, okay, we have vegetation going on over here on this plot of land. We have another partner working on this plot of land. And then you just clearly mark it out so that it is very visible and easily differentiated by us, the authority.
Yeah, and the model is not restrictive, right? It does encompass innovation, right? As long as the compliance mechanisms are being maintained. Like in today's cultivation world, you have farmers that would just come in and grow one single strain for season after season. So it's a possibility that you could have a centralized location, but you have different farmers doing different activities within the confined space of the license.
So you won't be able for each one to do a strain here, a strain there, a strain there. You have to be like in stages like
No. You could actually carry out the entire life cycle as an individual as long as you provide the mechanisms which are needed for track and trace. So your plants are documented and it's followed through the value chain from propagation to harvesting. So if you have demarcations within the perimeter fencing of your license, any activity that takes place within there, as long as it is compliant, there is no issue in terms of the activities that take place
in that
within
one
that
site?
space.
Are you talking about multiple sites?
Well,
one facility.
Yeah, well, there is also possibilities for satellite production sites, but that is something that we would have to look at in more detail based on the license and how it will be managed based on one license facilitating more than one cultivation site.
Good day again, still. Good night, I should say, still. I just have one or two maybe concerns still. It's not a serious concern, but it's something that we have to look at still. In your presentation, and you were speaking about the different countries, you realize as a continent, only in South Africa and the African continent, herb is pretty much decriminalized. And you know that is because of the colonial and the geopolitical situation facing the nation. It has nothing to do with what the people want. You recognize if we connect Africa to the Caribbean, we're opening gates that people don't want us to open, so they send their bombs, their guns, they threaten our lifestyles, our areas with all these destruction just because of this, you know. I got this thing as it's not even just about cannabis, but look, Jamaica tried to bring flights from Nigeria. Sankis was the first who tried to bring flights from Nigeria. People don't even know that it was Dr. Denzel Douglas administration actually was the first. And look what happened from that. His government had to change. A new government coming in, no flights from Nigeria, even up to now. We're talking, but we cannot land the flights them. Antigua land the flights, but then you see what happened. Spies and people creating dissension. Some of them want to go to another state. Some of them leaving because they're in problems. They don't have a good connection with Africa. But it's more than that, really. It's just that the powers that be, they're not freeing up Africa. There's still a big colonial problem in Africa. My case one, most Africa is under the British Commonwealth, but yet nobody could fight the case. Only now you see Nigeria and certain other countries using other cases and my cases and Zondo case in South Africa, because I use that case there too for privacy rights. It's there as a British Commonwealth nation in Africa, which is majority. They can fight and actually decriminalize, but the puppet leaders, them not making the right decision to do the best. And if we trade with Africa, imagine if we have flights coming from Africa to St. Kitts, bringing the gold, the diamonds, all the natural metals that they have in the earth that cost a lot of money. We'll be the first and the primary producers in the Caribbean, I mean the secondary producers in not producers, but we get the first opportunity to make the trade deal. So the US might have to come to us, Europe might have to come to the Caribbean to buy gold, silver, diamond. It will never happen. That's why they're trying to control the Caribbean now. It's a geopolitical situation that we find ourselves in a hard situation. And sometimes we throw a lot of fire upon the government officials, and the reality is rape. We're being raped again. We're being forced to do things against our will, and that's what rape is. It's not just about raping, a sexual rape. We have geopolitical rape going on right now. And we have to decide now where we stand. If we don't speak against it, then it's almost like we are agreeing with it. Sometimes it could be hard to speak against it and we face so much struggle. But we still have to be firm, courageous in spirit. We have to be like David and Goliath in these times, because the reality of the situation, if we do not open those doors in Africa for us to trade, not just cannabis, then our market value gone down. Look at the population in Africa. Nigeria having over 200 million people. You see? Exactly. So it's billions of people you're talking about at the end of the day. So, and that's a big trading block. And there's no way to communicate the trade between the two, because the powers that be do not want that part of the slave triangle to ever reconnect. And the only way for it to reconnect is with the help of the Almighty, because the reality of our geopolitical situation, we can't fight the wars physically that would free us. But based on the fact that we been always spiritual in nature, and we always been wise, Father always been with us as a people, that is what's going to keep us to conquer. But if we stay silent, then the will of the people doesn't exist anymore. You see it? We have to speak out still, because the only thing we have that is our strength is our word, power, and sound. You see what happened with reggae music and why they had to go and even kill Bob Marley. You see it? But the power is within our spirit, our word, our sound. That's our power. So I feel like that part of the economic growth that is not happening in Africa because of because Africa go the best herb. Period. There's no joke about it. But if they can't medicinalize it, if they can't go it legally, then they're really going no herb. You see it? And it's going to always be an under market. So I just want to show that concern there and give thanks.
A very valid one too, because the African continent, people on the African continent look to us for that kind of support. Like African youths are constantly linking me about genetics and seeds, and so on. And even just before coming here, I saw that Nigeria is actually looking to implement some form of cannabis reform. We also see where Ghana is engaging cannabis reform policy, and we even see countries like Malawi and Lesotho and these places have engaged in cannabis reform, and even my visit to the African continent, particularly in Shashamane, where the Rastafari community lives, and to understand that you are in your spiritual homeland, but you don't have religious freedom in terms of cannabis. So I went there to do some work looking at the prospects of approaching policy approach to fundamentally making some recommendations based on freedom of rights to the Rastafari community that lives over there. All right. Thank you very much.
We'll take one more question.
Greeting everybody. Good night. Pleasant, blessed to love. One other simple question. Going forward, the CEO, right? The Bridget mentioned about agriculture, sorry. Is it going to be differently from agriculture to go out to deal with marijuana? Or are you going to use the same extension office that deal with crops to deal with the same situation with herb? And next question, when Dr. Emanuel done do his recommendation and everything, where these seeds, you mentioned natural chemicals, not chemical, sprays for the herbs, and because in St. Kitts and Nevis, we run this time from November to say February, April, so we have a heavy lick with butterflies, with worms, especially in December, November. We don't get beaten by
caterpillars give you a
hard
time. What caterpillars?
Yeah, all kind. You got the green one, them. You got the black one. You got some smart one, like a spider web.
Okay.
Yeah, all about maybe we just say about 12 different type of butterfly eat marijuana now.
There is the loopers too.
Yeah,
you see the loopers.
Yeah.
Okay.
So we want to know still where can we get these products and how can we have seeds in terms of dealing with feminized seeds and the normal seeds? That's my simple question.
Well, as I mentioned, through the authority, I have made a commitment to donate some seeds to kickstarting the production. Based on my learned mind, based on integrated pest management, there are definitely preventative and curative measures we could apply to reducing the incidence of caterpillar damage to your cannabis flowers. And those recommendations, and those things could be facilitated through agricultural training programs to develop and understand the competence that is going to be needed in the supply chain of cannabis, particularly the use of non-highly hazardous pesticides that would not target the beneficial organisms such as the ladybirds and the praying mantis and the assassin bugs, right? So we want to maintain a particular efficacy where the environment is concern, and how we manage the ecosystems surrounding these cannabis farms to ensure the sustainability of production takes place locally.
So from the authority standpoint, as you said, we'll do the heavy lifting for you. We'll go out and try to find these natural products so that we can recommend them to you, the cultivators. Because currently as it stands, traditional farmers, crop farmers, they use a lot of hazardous, for lack of a better word, pesticides. And I envision for this industry that we would actually be the forerunners, the ones that are engaging in the most sustainable practices and using the best types of pesticides and fertilizers.
As we wrap up, I want to thank Dr. Emanuel and Mr. Mills for this engaging discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for your participation. This concludes our public lecture. Safe travels.